From Shine Cancer Support, this is
Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show.
Hi, I'm Tatum and today we're talking about reconnecting with our minds. Because we know the mental weight of a diagnosis can be surprising, confusing, and even catching up to us years later. And I've got three great guests here with me today. David was 38 when he was diagnosed with bowel cancer and realised how he coped with treatment actually didn't work afterwards. Harriet is a researcher on a large-scale study looking into the long-term mental health effects of a diagnosis. And Clare, she's been on the podcast before, was diagnosed at 17, now works at Shine, and she's going to share some ways that we can begin that reconnection process. So we've got loads to talk about. Let's get going.
This is Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show. Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show.
Hi, David.
Hi, Tatum. How are you? You okay?
Yeah, all good. Can you tell me what was going on in your life when you were diagnosed?
I was 38 when I was diagnosed. So I was married, which remains, yes, still the case. Two kids. I had a daughter. She was 3 at the time, and a son who was 6. And I suppose I was quite alpha. I was quite stoical, and I'd like to project a resilience. So that was my identity, really. I was pretty workish, quite keen on work, quite ambitious. For my employer, I was on the senior leadership team, and I was a real doer. And that was, again, a big part of my identity. In terms of other things, I was pretty sociable because I was diagnosed in the July of 21, and that was after a few lockdowns. So I was kind of, going out a lot, socialising and managing to weld that in with work. And I was into exercise, and I was running and I was cycling. I was also an active dad. I was trying to be an active husband because all of the relationships and everything, they do take effort, don't they?
Yeah, I can imagine that you were just so busy.
Yeah, well, everyone's busy, aren't they? But it did feel like a busy time. And then on the other hand, I was pretty ill. I was very anemic. My illness had been going on for a few months without me really being able to identify it. I thought I had long COVID. So yeah, very anemic. I was sleep deprived because part of the physical manifestations would keep me up at night. And I was just pretty exhausted and stressed out. And on top of that, we were moving from Bristol, where we live now, to a town outside of the city. So there was a lot going on. There was a lot of nervous energy. There was probably a lot of projecting because I was ambitious. I had an identity, and that was built around a lot of kind of resilience, really. And there was a lot of caffeine, and there was probably a little bit too much booze. But that's where I was, really. I mean, when I look back, I'd probably say that I was a bit of a busy fool, but we all do our best, and that's just where I was.
Yeah, and in the midst of all of that, you're not thinking about cancer, are you? If you're feeling a bit run down or, like you said, a bit anemic, there's so many things you could put that down to. 2 young children, really busy work, being social, kind of seizing the moment, moving house. I mean, any one of those things can kind of leave us feeling a bit, you said, a bit tired. So what was it that made you think, actually, I need to go check this out?
So it was fundamentally the physical impact of the anemia. So for months and months, what should have been a red flag, and I didn't really identify, was my physical performance. So I'd always been into running to an extent. And in the 2020, I've been able to run a half marathon in a reasonably comfortable time. And by about March 2021, I could barely run 5K without stopping. And I just couldn't really get up the stairs without losing breath. But what really got me going was I had something called restless leg syndrome. And that's something that I understand can also happen to pregnant ladies. And it's a result of anemia. And that would get me out of bed 3 or 4 times a night. And I'd have to actually do calf stretches and sometimes walk up and down the stairs. And I'd also have instances where it was bowel cancer that I'd have what was effectively a blocked bowel. So I'd have a lot of pain from that.
Yeah.
And all of that, like I say, I was very tired, and I phoned up the GP one day to see if they would prescribe me antidepressants an antidepressant medicine because at that point I thought I was possibly depressed. And the GP, to their infinite credit, wouldn't do that and asked me to go in to have blood tests. And I did that on the Friday. By the Wednesday, I was having a reasonably uncomfortable telephone conversation. And then the following Monday, I was having colonoscopies and then CT scans, and it all moved ever so quickly. I mean, incredibly, from the day of my diagnosis to me taking my last chemo tablet was 9 months, which always astounds me because 9 months is the period of time that whether the baby takes to grow.
Yeah.
And in that time, I did so much in my life. Whereas with a baby, when you have a baby, you then have it for about 18 years. Whereas I did all of this stuff and then thought I'd move on.
Right. So how did you sort of approach going into treatment? Like, what was sort of your mental state? Because you hadn't been feeling well. Were you run down? Were you kind of feeling like, okay, I've got a path that I'm on right now. I know what I need to do.
Yeah, so I was initially stunned, of course. I simply didn't see it coming, despite the fact that I'd been ill for so long. And I needed to have a couple of iron infusions to get me to any state of physical ability. And then once I'd had those, it did all move very quickly, for which I was grateful. And then I just heaped positivity upon it. I just threw relentless positivity upon positivity. And when I think back, I was in a situation where I had young kids, and I was lucky in that they weren't old enough to really understand, to kind of witness and interpret and join the dots up. But I had those. I had my wife. My mum had lost family herself to cancer. So I think I wanted to project positivity. And there was no suggestion or inference from my family that they needed that. It was just that was part of my identity, that resilience, and the alpha male thing, I can do this, do a strong arm emoji. Yep. This is okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it didn't feel like there was any other option. And when I look back, I can remember myself saying things like, I'd regularly say the show must go on, and that I was lucky to have identified it and lucky to have be in a situation where I was having treatment. So yeah, just a lot of positivity. So then I took my medicine and I suffered through it. But again, I think there's something in this alpha male thing where, an element of suffering isn't particularly bad for you. And I'd constantly look on the bright side. I didn't really complain. And I'd actually ask for more medicine periodically because I just wanted the efficacy there to get rid of the cancer. So I did all of that and I got through it. And yeah, my appraisal of it was just positive. I was lucky. I was lucky to have been eligible for the chemo. I was lucky to have been physically robust enough to take it, because you see people in terrible, terrible conditions. So for me, I was blessed, really. So then my identity and my relationship with that was that I was, a positive cancer survivor that was moving on.
Right. And I can see how that does become an identity, doesn't it? And
sure.
Did you ever find if there was ever any cracks or any concerns, did you just heap more positivity on top of those cracks?
Yeah, pretty much. I just threw positivity at it. If I was feeling down, I'm a big believer that things pass. So even if I was having a bad day or I was having a bad experience, once I got hospitalized, and that was quite possibly a bowel twist, and it was just incredibly painful. So I left my house on the Friday in an ambulance, and I was loaded up on morphine and had like a just real comedy moment. But yeah, it was a pretty low point. And then my boss said to me a few days later, kind of, how are you? And even then I reflected on it positively, because I said, look, I think I've hit rock bottom really with this, but at least I know that when I'm at the bottom, I've still got something.
Yeah.
So it was just always positivity.
Yeah. Can you take me to the point that started to not work anymore? When did that happen for you?
I think it was probably around September or October of last year, so 2023, which would have been roughly 18 months after I finished my treatment. So at the time I was physically well, no evidence of disease, cycling, running's going well. professionally, that was going fine, ticking all the boxes really.
Yeah.
But it had become apparent that my iron, which had been part of the initial basis upon which the cancer was identified, I was having problems with my iron in that my iron had dropped quite a low level. So I was suffering from fatigue, headaches, brain fog. So there was a legacy there. And in my head, I'd moved on from cancer. So moving on from cancer whilst having a cancer legacy are kind of incongruous. Yeah. I'd started a new job. And part of the reason I'd started a new job again was I wanted to move on from cancer. I wasn't, in my last job, I was almost positively discriminated against, if that makes sense. And I was a positive cancer survivor, but I just wanted to go on and be someone who was just Dave rather than Cancer Dave.
So in terms of that positive discrimination, can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my previous employer was absolutely fantastic, just unbelievable. And my return to work was great. All of the support was great. But in my head, I'd get great feedback once we did a peer review across the senior leadership team. And all of my peers said I was amazing. Okay. But I couldn't accept that didn't have a positive bias. So I wanted to go somewhere where I was me. Yeah. Where someone wasn't looking at me going, well, I can't give Dave negative feedback. He's had cancer.
Yeah.
In my new job, I didn't want anyone to know that I'd had cancer. But then immediately that I start my new job, I've got chronic iron issues. And I need to talk to my boss because it's evident that I'm not at the races really. So straight away, within a few weeks, I'm saying, look, I'm really sorry. I've got an issue. It's related to cancer. And I'm cringing because he's got no relationship with me. And I feel like, oh, gosh, what am I putting on you here?
Yeah.
So there's new relationships, new conversations, and I've got a brand new cancer dynamic, really, because I've gone from being someone at the start of September who's moving on, new job, parking it, to someone who's actually got a cancer legacy with their iron, and they need to talk about it in the workplace, but they don't really know how to talk about it. So where I'd said that my identity was a positive cancer survivor that was moving on, that wasn't my identity anymore. And I didn't actually know what my identity was. What did become apparent is that I couldn't just move on from cancer. Cancer was actually a part of my life. And then what became apparent is that I hadn't really dealt with it. Where I just heaped positivity upon it, I had never spent any time with it. Quite quickly, some negative stuff kind of snuck. It didn't even sneak up on me, actually. It just sort of jumped me. And I was feeling quite isolated. I was quite confused with my emotions because by this point, I was actually 2 years on from surgery. And me, again, still being a little alpha, I didn't think 2 years on from surgery, I'd feel so emotional about it. And then I'd start to feel quite withdrawn. And I managed to sort of understand that what I was doing was I was almost terminating emotions. I was shutting things down. And I don't think that you can just turn off negative emotions. If you're turning off some emotions, I think you're pretty much turning all of them off. So I just felt completely separated. And in around the October time and September, I had a few incidences where it was really obvious that I wasn't great. I went to a wedding in Spain, and I've absolutely nothing against people drinking, but I made a decision to stop drinking because it didn't feel very sensible given my history. So at a wedding in Spain, where it's, like Club Tropicana, the drinks are free, the cava is certainly flowing, and I'm probably the only sober person there. And I literally felt like I was a fish in a goldfish bowl or something. I felt so out of place. Yeah. And I just ended up staying up all night. I went for a walk at about 4 o'clock in the morning around the beach because I was just so kind of confused and bereft.
I can see how that would also relate to what was going on inside you. There was a disconnection sort of with your own emotions and acknowledging them and kind of separating them. But then that separation is also echoed outside in your life as well. that description of sort of being a fish out of water, I imagine that those were your friends or your family that you would have normally been swimming at that wedding, so to speak, doing what everyone else was doing.
Quite. So it was hard to relate to. And then a few weeks later, we went to Wales. And at this point, I just start openly crying. It was the strangest thing because I wouldn't be feeling particularly sad. But we'd gone to Wales because we were getting a puppy, which is obviously a happy thing. But we'd be in the car and I'd just start crying. So all of that really, I do believe that you need to try things. And I wasn't happy to roll along like that because ultimately we all want to be happy, right? And it was evident to me that I wasn't happy. So it was fortunate that at the time, I'm in Bristol and the hospital here has been fantastic with me. I've been very lucky and they've got an extremely helpful, compassionate and caring colorectal team. And I was due a call with them and we spoke about that and they were able to signpost me to a third party. And pretty quickly, she identified that I was in a depressed state. And it was interesting. She gave me, she identified quickly as well that I hadn't dealt with the negative aspects, that I'd just been positive. So she prescribed periods for me to sit and identify with my negative emotions towards it. And we called it crying time. So I'd effectively sit and look at photos or listen to songs, or strangely for anyone who uses it, what I said about my running, I'd look at segments on Strava and remember how much I was suffering. And I'd just cry. And she also suggested that I spend time with other people who have experienced or are experiencing cancer. And she suggested the group settings. So that was it really. That went on over a period of, say, 6 or 7 months. And as last winter went, I'd say that last winter was as nutritional as hard as the winter that I was actually having chemo. Obviously totally different, but very, very challenging.
Yeah. So many of the things that you've said are things that don't get talked about. That weight, that impact on your emotions, on how you feel about yourself, your identity, doesn't really get discussed that much. And there is, in the media, this kind of like, oh yeah, just be positive. A lot of the depictions that we see of people with cancer are, no complaining, always looking on the bright side, being incredibly grateful. But actually, when that goes on for a really long time, that sadness just kind of rose up. And then you're left, a couple of years later, really in the thick of it, of handling all of that all together. How was it that you came to find Shine and find out about the breakout program?
Well, it was through my wife, Fran. She's been great during the whole cancer journey, and she's super organised and she's very good at researching. I was aware of a lot of groups and a lot of podcasts and stuff like that from day one. But I was at the preconception that it wouldn't be useful for me. Again, it might have been that alpha thing. But Fran introduced me to Shine. And at first I was sort of like a passive user. So I dip my toe in the water, read posts and send people emojis. And then really as a consequence of what I was saying earlier, my counsellor advocating some group interactions, I made a post in around February time. And I dug it out the other day and read it, and it was quite stark really. It was a cry for help. And someone on there actually recommended the breakout program for me. And since then, there's a very fast response. I had a chat with Clare, and I've been on it this morning.
Oh, excellent. And how are you finding it? How is it to talk to other people?
Oh, it's really important. I think it's such a positive thing to do. It makes you appreciate so many different things. It makes you understand that you've gone through and you're going through something really difficult. And it's okay to say that it's difficult, because all the time, I think it's so natural to say, look, I'm doing this, but other people do it.
Yeah.
And if someone else can do it, then that's fine. It can't be that bad. But it's really difficult. And it's really nice to interact with a group of people that understand that, and that understand that it's sad, and understand that it's hard. There's the support and the empathy, and there's, a bit of a esprit de corps, like you're happy for people when you hear them saying positive things, even if it's of no material interest to yourself. I've loved hearing some of the things that people on the group have said, because if it makes them happy and they're in a difficult situation, then that's really great, and it just brings a little bit of warmth.
Yeah, and there's also a different quality to that positivity, because it's real. When you're in a space that someone can tell you, oh my God, this is so awful, this is just the worst, and can tell you, oh, I had the best day. There's something about the authenticity of that loveliness that you can take that joy in someone else.
I mean, you've kind of hit something there, because I was worried that it would be a negative exercise, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that it would be a forum that was, overtly negative. But it's not at all. I mean, we speak about bad stuff and it's sad, but it's not negativity for negativity's sake. We talk about these things, and I think we feel better for talking about them.
Yeah.
I certainly do. And you understand different ways to approach different things, and, in a sense, that's wisdom. So you're better armed, and you just don't feel so alone with it.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing all of that, David. And I know that so many people listening to this are going to be really resonating with so much of what you've said. I'd love to bring Clare into the conversation here, because Clare works at Shine. I mean, at this point, you've probably met hundreds, thousands people with cancer. You've been on the podcast before, but can you share what your diagnosis was and what you do with Shine?
You're right. I probably have met maybe thousands of people, which is it's an odd way to be in the world, isn't it? But yes, I was diagnosed with an osteosarcoma in my chest wall when I was 17, and I had a whole lot of treatment that took me into I got into remission when I was about 20, but it was a really intense few years of kind of a lot of hospital treatment. And actually then I didn't come across Shine until a really long time. It was probably only about 9 years ago. So we're talking like 15 years later. It was actually through some other work I was doing. And it was the first time I'd come across anything that was like peer support for people who had been through cancer at any point, who were in their 20s and 30s. It was I just hadn't found anything like that, and it just sounded great. So I went along as a member initially and just was like, right, I found my people, that's awesome. I was really like a long way past my diagnosis by that point, but for me, the kind of fallout, the medical fallout of my treatment has been pretty profound. So I still have kind of conditions that are incurable and I have to have a lot of treatment for. So I just thought I wanted to talk to people who would get that. Do you know what I mean? That long-term effect. So yeah, after a really quick time, I felt well at home, and I started off volunteering, but subsequently over the years, I've started facilitating sessions. And then when a job came up as the program manager, I thought, right, that's the one for me. I've been doing that for the last two and a bit years. So that's how I got into Shine. But yeah, now I manage all that. We've got 4 online programs. The Breakout is one of them. My job is managing and talking. I get the privilege of talking to everyone who comes on those programs before they start, which is just such a lovely thing to do.
And so how often do you hear stories like David's?
It's really interesting listening to David's story, because I'm always struck by how obviously unique everyone is, and they come at these experiences from completely different contexts and backgrounds. And the way that I can relate to what David's saying, whilst having never been a manager or someone who runs marathons, or, the similarities are far outweigh the differences for me. I can't think of a time where there've been 2 people in a room who've had cancer who couldn't find something in common. There is always the kind of stories about managing and coping and how things feel for some time afterwards. It's a really, I never want to say it's normal, because it doesn't feel normal for the people going through it. And for you, this is life-changing and really different. It's a really normal reaction to what is an abnormal situation, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what in your experience of talking to so many people, are like some of the factors that bring about, you know, that sort of mental impact and how that can be a long time later?
There are lots of things going on that cause people to struggle, obviously. And there are probably more than we could even talk about in this time. But I mean, some of the main ones, and these are things that we talk about a lot in our program sessions because we think they're really important. One of which is just the level of uncertainty that people are living with when they go through this stuff. I mean, people can kind of, I think, appreciate that you're uncertain as to maybe the outcome of treatment, but maybe they don't appreciate all the nuanced uncertainties that come with that. The sort of like, how am I going to feel when I wake up tomorrow? What are the side effects going to be like? How are my friends going to react to me? What's my work environment? There's so many unknowns. And I think particularly for young people, you are living ordinarily in a kind of very structured, you have a plan and it's broken up by life events like relationship, career, getting a house, maybe having children if that's what you want. Like that there's this structure, and having that blown up, I think you come from a place that feels certain, although we know none of it is guaranteed, to a place where managing all of that uncertainty causes huge amounts of stress and anxiety. So that's just one thing. And that's pretty big on its own.
Absolutely.
We know that people are also managing grief and loss, and that's huge. And again, people kind of think of the obvious big losses, maybe the visible losses, losing your hair, or, you know, potentially the worst, the biggest thing that everyone's scared of is treatment not working and losing your life. And people can go to those big losses, but they don't always appreciate the kind of incremental, the loss of independence, the loss of being able to be impulsive, of being able to travel, of being able to, of confidence, of self-esteem, of body image. It's so many. When we talk about all these in the sessions, and it's a really powerful experience just naming them.
Yeah.
David said, like, about identity, you know, that's a huge one as well. Like, you just feel like you've been completely recalibrated and you've got to go back into familiar environments feeling like a completely new person. And it can feel like you're sort of, I don't know, in an old environment, but wearing clothes that don't fit. You kind of like feel all uncomfortable in your own skin because it doesn't feel like me anymore. Mm. And that's just like, I've just picked up a few. Do you know what I mean? There are more things that cause this disruption. The fact also that people often feel like they're doing it on their own, even though they might be surrounded by people. We know that younger people going through cancer often feel really isolated. So there's something about realizing that you're not on your own is really cathartic, and the relief we see in the sessions where people go, oh God, thank God I'm not the only one who says that or thinks that. I thought I was losing my mind, or I thought I was, you know, really struggling. And I guess we're just really keen to acknowledge that this is just those things I've mentioned, and there are more. That like this is a huge amount of emotional turbulence, and sort of encouraging people to see it as though you're not coping well, but just look how you're coping, giving everything that you've got going on, which is a really normal reaction. Yeah. Trying to twist that a bit, because it's easy to pathologize and be like, this is awful, and having a complete crisis, whereas actually it feels like a really sane reaction to a really difficult situation.
Yeah, some of that is being able to reframe it, and actually maybe what we were doing before is, oh, I didn't do that very well, I need to switch that up and, you know, go forward. Maybe that was our original coping mechanism. Yeah. But actually with this, it is kind of cultivating a bit more of a compassionate, this is some of the hugest things that any humans have to deal with. And it cuts through, like you were saying, on so many different levels. And I love so many different parts of David's story, but being surrounded at the wedding by so many people, and you were talking about clothes that didn't fit, like that thing of moving through your life, but it's to some degree an alien landscape. And when you try to do things like, okay, you know what, I'm going to leave my job, I'm going to put that behind, I'm going to park it, that it follows you. So there's something about that is so totally unfair. Like,
I mean, it sucks, right? It really sucks.
Unfair. Like, you know, that if someone really wants to like positive it up, park it and move on. But we've both seen from so many years of doing these programs is actually at some point in order to sort of reintegrate back into your life, like that reconnection sort of happened. Thank you so much for that, Claire. I want to bring Harriet in here because, Harriet, you've got a really wide perspective on this because you, of course, have just been part of a large-scale study. Can you tell me a little bit about it and what it was looking at?
So I work in a research group called Beyond Cancer Group, where we look at the long-term health of cancer survivors. And our research is all about trying to improve the health and well-being of cancer survivors. And we know from research priority setting exercises where people interview cancer patients to see what research they think is important, mental health always comes up as a kind of top research priority. So understanding the short and the long-term impacts on your psychological health of cancer is really important. So we sort of looked at the evidence, and actually the evidence on mental health after cancer is actually quite limited at the moment. So a lot of the evidence looks at the short-term risk, but doesn't look at longer-term risk. And certain groups of cancer survivors haven't been looked at in detail. So like younger cancer survivors is definitely one of them. And also people with kind of pre-existing mental health conditions. So we wanted to address some of those limitations in the kind of existing research. So we carried out a study using routinely collected healthcare data, so GP and hospital records. And we had just over 800,000 cancer survivors. And we matched them to people who didn't have a history of cancer, so that we could kind of follow them up in their GP and hospital records to see what the risk of mental health outcomes was in cancer survivors compared to cancer-free comparators. And we selected the 20 most common cancers in the UK. And we found a very consistent pattern that for all cancer survivors, there was this increased risk of anxiety and depression after cancer.
This went from 1998 to 2018.
Yes.
So, I mean, when we think back to 1998, it seems sort of like the dark ages of mental health and, that everyone was just stiff upper lipping it going through. But did you find that even then people were accessing support and going to the GP and requiring assistance with that?
Yeah, even then, the effects became larger in later time periods, which we'd sort of expect as, people have got more, there's less stigma around having a mental health diagnosis, and there's greater recognition that, to go to your GP. But certainly, we still saw the same patterns prior to sort of 2002. So even between 1998 and 2002, we still saw these increased risks.
So interesting, because I think there is something about the isolation of that feeling, but actually the study that you've done, 800,000 people is a huge study, and seeing it so consistently and over time, were you able to break it down by age? Was there anything in terms of sort of younger people in there?
Yeah, we were expecting to see greater risks of mental health issues in under 50s, as that had been reported in a few studies. I suppose the first thing is we saw an increased risk across all age groups. So at whatever age you get diagnosed with cancer, there does seem to be this increased risk. But we did see for some of the more common cancers, so breast cancer, colorectal cancer, and uterine cancer, among the under 50s, they had the highest risk of having depression and anxiety compared with kind of older age cancers. We didn't see it for the other cancers, but that might just be because the numbers, despite the fact that we had a really large study, the numbers are still small for some of those other cancers. It does seem that for those a few cancers, we do see greater risks in under 50s.
Yeah, and it did, sort of cross my mind. When you're younger, there's like more of a hormonal impact and kind of the impact of menopause for some cancers, or, sort of male hormone disruption as well. And that would seem to more impact younger people than, sort of later later on in life. Was there anything about the study that surprised you?
The thing that was most surprising to us was seeing that the risks were sustained over time. So what we did, we looked at cancer survivors who'd survived 5 years post-diagnosis and compared those to cancer-free comparators. We still saw an increased risk of depression 5 years from diagnosis. And that did surprise us, because we knew that we expected to see an increased risk in that period during treatment, cancer treatment, and that we know that's very distressing. But of course, as we've heard on this call, the long-term effects of cancer, they can last for a long time. So even 5 years from diagnosis, we saw an increased risk for most cancers.
If someone's listening that's not saying you're definitely going to have a mental health impact, but that actually, if things are hard, if, kind of your life is like an ill-fitting jumper, if, those conversations with your boss are kind of like really weighing on you, if you're not feeling like you're in your skin or your identity or in the flow of your life, that's quite normal. And what would you like, Harriet, for healthcare professionals to take away from this study?
There's sort of a few things, I suppose, that we can see that having had cancer is a risk factor for having mental health outcomes. And so if healthcare professionals can ask about a patient's mental health and offer support, that's really important. It's also important to think that you're not just needing to look out for mental health issues in that first year from diagnosis, but to continue to ask about their mental health many years after their cancer. And finally, I suppose we saw the highest risks of mental health problems in people who had cancers with poorer prognosis and who were diagnosed at a later stage. So those people ideally we target for kind of greater mental health support.
So it's like all across the board, but then poorer prognosis, kind of needing elevated support. That's really incredible study. And I think we sort of imagine that this has been looked at more. When you come into like the cancer world and being sick, you're like, oh, I'm sure there's a study for everything. And actually what you were saying at the beginning was there is a gap. And your study just came out like really recently. This is hot off the press, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes. So it's not actually gone through the peer review process yet, but it's under review at a journal and there's a preprint out.
Thank you so much. Do you know what your future studies or where this goes kind of going forward?
I suppose so. I'm quite interested in looking at if we can unpick some of the drivers of the mental health, of what's causing these mental health issues, so that we can kind of address them. So how much is being driven by some like adverse physical health consequences that you get after cancer? How much is around a kind of like fear of recurrence? Can we unpick some of those drivers and then we can perhaps more adequately address them? So I think that's, for me in terms of this space, what's the next steps?
Oh, yeah. And there's so many things. We've done episodes of the podcast on shame, on guilt, on those things that are not, no one's going to look at you and know that you're feeling that from the outside, but actually, identity, sexuality, so many parts of a person can be affected that goes beyond like the physical. And thank you so much for doing that. And thank you for being here and sort of sharing. So if people are listening to this, like you are definitely not alone with this. Claire, if someone is listening and is like, okay, I think I'd like some support, what's kind of a first step of what somebody might do or kind of approach acknowledging what they've been through?
Well, I'd say in terms of what we can offer at Shine, it's just to flag up front that none of our services are time limited, because we know, as we've mentioned lots in this conversation, that there's no one time that people will need support. So even if you're 5-10 years down the line and suddenly it's hit you for whatever reason, or you just feel like you want to chat about it, like there's no limit on anything that we do. You can join in wherever you're at in that process. The thing I know from talking to so many people is that everyone needs support in a different way, right? So I wouldn't say there's one first step that is going to be the right first step for everyone. So I think that's why we try and offer support in all sorts of different platforms and mediums. So actually just listening to this podcast might make you feel like, I'm not on my own. That allows me maybe to have some conversations with people. But in terms of connecting with others at Shine, we've got our local networks where you can just drop in to a local meetup once a month and meet people in real life in a non-sort of clinical hospital-y environment. It'll be really chilled out. It might just be a pint in the pub, but with people who get it. And if you're a social extrovert, then that might be your thing. If you prefer more structured conversations that are a bit more contained in a smaller group, our online programs are there for you. And like I say, there are lots of different ones. They're all on our website. But whether you're living with an incurable diagnosis, whether you're in your 20s, we have a different program for you, the breakout program for everyone. And we do a program for plus ones as well. So there really is something for everyone there. But the great thing about Shine is we are a small team. So actually you can just drop us a line and someone will be able to have a chat and we can work out what works for you. And I think sometimes that's the best approach, because we've got so much to offer. But like I say, everyone needs support in their own way at their own time. So we can help you work out what that might look like.
And we have Shine Connect, which is our conference, which is a really lovely way, it's in London, it's in October. Come and meet people and kind of get a sample of different things that Shine offers. It's a super fun day. But you did a presentation last year at the conference. And it was so interesting because I think people go, yeah, well, I don't know what talking about it's going to do. It's not going to change anything. And you did a presentation about what happens inside your brain when you don't talk and when you do. Can you tell me, when you're in that alarmed, pushing things away mode, what's happening inside our heads?
Just broadly, in a general sense, the session was about what happens when we're anxious and that we can sometimes feel like this is just a feeling and I've just got to not feel it and then I'll be fine. But actually, there is an awful lot going on in our bodies when we're anxious. And there's a very complex system that gets triggered when we feel fear or anxiety or stress. But the amygdala is just one part of that very complex system. And I always like to think of it as in the session, we talked about it as like a panicky person with a really loud bell, that every time it gets anxious, it just rings this bell and it sets off this whole system of events in your body. It will send all sorts of chemicals through your system that will tell your body to do things like raise your heart rate, make you breathe faster, make you sweaty, make your eyes wide so you're alert for danger. And it really does hark back to sort of caveman, when you needed to be like that to survive. It's less useful now because it's unusual that we have to fight off, predators and bears and lions. But our brain still tends to respond in the same way to fear.
When that's happening, when that bell is ringing, when that amygdala is on center stage, where is our reasoning?
Well, this is it exactly. So what we're doing then is our brain is telling our body we're in danger. And it's not particularly rational. It's just reacting immediately. It kind of bypasses the rational part of our brain and just tells our body to feel fear and be at risk and be hyper alert. What we can do, though, is tell our brain that we're safe with things we do with our body. And there's two, the very basics, calming down your breathing, shutting your eyes. Those are all things that you wouldn't do if you were in danger. So that behavior will kind of complete the loop, if you like, and tell your brain that you're safe, and it will start to calm down all those chemicals. That's one way of doing it. The other way is if you're talking about an experience, in order to tell someone, I went through this and it was really scary and this is what happened, you necessarily have to order it. You have to kind of sort through the event and the experience, put it into some sort of order to construct a narrative to tell someone. And by doing that, you're bringing it into that rational part of your brain that can get bypassed when there's sort of crazy alarm systems going off. So just by talking, you're giving your brain a chance at least. It doesn't mean it's going to immediately go away and you're never going to feel fear. Of course it doesn't. but you're giving your brain a chance to bring it into a more rational place where you can start to challenge and go, am I actually in danger right now? And you can start to be in that rational part of your brain, which is a place where you've got a better chance of calming down some of that body reaction.
I love thinking of it that way because it's another way to kind of look at, like, what does our body need? And last month we were reconnecting with our body, and this month we're reconnecting with our mind. Of course, there's that connection with the body, but actually that thing of using your prefrontal cortex, like kind of when the amygdala takes center stage, it's like when you talk about something, your prefrontal cortex has to like take center stage back from the amygdala.
It has to show up. It has to become part of the chat.
Even by doing that, like you said, it's not like 100%, but it's like starting that process. So being able to combine that with things that you do for your body that tell you that you're safe and being able to talk, it's almost like I see sort of like a pincer response coming in at all sides.
Absolutely. But these things do have to be at the right time as well. Like I know from my experience, when I was in the midst of treatment and it was pretty brutal and I couldn't get out of bed and I was very physically unwell, I couldn't work out what was going on to say it out loud. And I think it probably would have been too difficult to do at that point. So it's not to say like, this is the catch-all for every point in your journey. And actually everyone I talk to, some people are very newly diagnosed. They're like, I just feel a bit numb. And you're like, so it would be difficult to verbalize. Yeah. So it's not a catch-all, but it's definitely worth, when you feel like it, you think, well, this might help. Give it a go for sure. And you can give it a go with Shine. It's a safe place to practice.
What you use to get through something. So David sort of hurling positivity, but also that numbness, that disconnection. Like if you're feeling numb 5 years later, if that positivity has become sort of manic positivity 5 years later to the point that you're not yourself anymore, it's like something that can be a good thing that gets you through something. So it's valid, but it's just the time that it spends there can be the turn of what was once useful now not being so useful. And just knowing that, other people are going through that. David, I'd love to bring you in for sort of a last words here. What would you like to sort of tell healthcare professionals? Do you wish that someone had told you that this was possible, just like any other side effect or symptom?
Yeah, I think so. I think it would have been beneficial. I mean, I do feel sorry for the NHS in many respects, and I think that this is interesting because it brings into question what the remit of the NHS is. I mean, they did fundamentally physically make me better from cancer, which is amazing. But equally, I think it's, I regret that kind of 2 years on, 2.5, 3 years on, I'm having to do this now via a charity, really. I mean, it's amazing that I can do this through you guys, and it's something that I'm grateful for. But I wish that it hadn't been incumbent on me sort of seeking you out or my wife seeking you out, and that I hadn't had to sort of be my own advocate so much. So sorry, long answer, when essentially, yes, I wish that it was more central.
If you could whisper a bit of advice back to yourself, like back in time, what do you think you might have said?
What you and Claire were just saying then was really interesting, because positivity did work for me at the time. But I'd probably tell myself to try and have a little bit more balance. I was always quite binary in that I could only pursue positivity. I don't think I cried. I didn't acknowledge that it was bad. I achieved positivity. So I'd tell myself to be a bit more balanced. And I'd definitely tell myself to go down the route like something that I have with Shine, because it does help to talk and it helps to get opinion, helps to get more perspective. And that, it really does come around to that, doesn't it? Kind of that reconnecting with your mind, reconnecting with who you are, kind of that reframing of actually you are doing a lot and it is a lot. And there is, different ways to find support. And I loved what you said with that, Claire, like everybody is different. So like how everyone would access support
check out shinecancersupport.org. There's tons of information on there. There's loads of different things. Thank you to the amazing Radio Facilities for sponsoring our podcast. And thank you to my amazing guests, Claire, Harriet, and David. I will see you all soon. But for now, it's goodbye. Bye. Till next time.
This is not your grandma's cancer show. Not your grandma's cancer show.